Hey YouTubers, quick video to ask the question whether you can line render on stud partitioning. In the olden days, I think they would have used a what they call lath plaster, which are a bit of little strips of wood which run along about kind of like an old wooden ruler, if you've ever seen one of those, about that sort of size. Nail them on, hundreds of them all over the place. You can still buy them. They're normally made out of some kind of hardwood. You can split your own out of a plank if you're a bit desperate, or in this case I've done something a bit peculiar, which is I stacked up a bunch of this thin plywood, about 10 at a time in a pile, and then just drilled loads of holes through them. This reason I did that is because when you're squashing this bit, I did probably about a month ago when I did this wall here, which is not stud partitioning. This is an external wall made out of concrete blocks. But as you can see, when you put the line render on, it squidges through the holes and it gives it a kind of purchase. You can see if you can pick it off, and it's pretty good stuff. It's stuck on pretty well, to be honest. And this is when you've got an edge to get your nail under, but it does stick very well to this plywood. And you can imagine if you've got a reasonable thickness with it poking through the holes behind, then that's not going to come off. So on this I've been putting a very thin layer. That's probably not the best example. There's hardly any space there at all, but you can see I've just left the door linings a bit proud, and then just run up to the edge of there with your line render, probably only 3 or 4 millimeters. The only thing really to watch out for, this is the stuff that's just been put on, is that of course it's tempting to rush now and try and finish it off with your sponge or however you're finishing it, but really you need to leave that for a good few hours for it to go quite hard before you touch it with a sponge. Otherwise it will just start slumping off. I mean, it's not too bad. If you're desperate, you can still do it with a sponge, but any kind of sheen on the surface like this to me indicates that it's still too wet. And your best is just to leave it. So this bit here I did today, which is on concrete block, and it's dried off pretty well, and that's ready for a sponge float now. This is a sponge float. I forget who this is made by, Refine or something like that. Anyway, it's quite good because when you put it on the wall and you rub like this, it shows you any low spots. So you can see just here where I've roughed up this area by sponging it, but there's a smooth area here, and that's where the sponge is going over the top of a depression, a little hollow in the line render. So what I'll do in a minute is I'll get my smoothing trowel and I'll just put a tiny bit more render in there. I mean, the alternative. So it needs to be nice and dry. You can tell by the sound actually. Can you hear that sound? Okay, if you've got that sound, then it's good for sponging. If it's quite quiet when you put it on the wall, should we just have a go and see what happens? This is how not to do it. Okay, so this is quite wet. Okay. And when I try and sponge it, you can see two things happen. I get lots of really big marks because it's too wet still. And also, if you see that there? Oh god, it's stuck. That's another thing that can happen. You get stuck on there. You see? And as you move the thing, you can see you get a little wave of wet mortar in front of the sponge float. Well, that's not very good really. Well, I don't think it is anyway. So I will probably wait until it's nice and dry. Let's see if we can do this bit here. So how dry is this? See, that's not bad actually. If you sort of tap it and it almost feels hard with your knuckle, then it's probably ready to go. So we'll just float this bit up. I should point out this bit is not actually on the stud partition, this is on the old house wall. But even that, I think, is probably still a little bit too wet. You can see it shifting around as you're sponging it, and look, down below I've opened up, it started to fall off the wall because it's probably a bit too thick there, but we'll just leave that until it's properly hard, because you just make more work for yourself doing that. So there you go. You can render, lime render on a stud partition. The results are not as good as when you do it on a, here we go. They're not as good. Sorry, it's a bit dark in here, and I've taken the light bulb out for one reason or another. But, you know, that is kind of what it looks like. You might get some cracking. But, you know, you could whitewash that with the lime whitewash, get rid of that, would fill in the cracks, and you'd have quite a nice sort of normal kind of stud partition wall, but covered in lime render. So sorry it's so dark, I can't really get any light in there for you. But perhaps after I've sponged this up later, I'll do another quick video, and we'll have a look how I've got on. But yeah, using this thin plywood, 6mm plywood, nailed or screwed onto the stud partitioning. You drill holes in it before you put it up, when it's stacked up, and then you can lime render on top of it. If you wanted some extra security, you could get some sheets of expanded metal lathe and put those up. You could even use some kind of textile or paper, such as something like a roofing felt or something like that. You could staple that across the battens, and then you could put expand the metal lathe on top of that, and then render on top of that. The lime render will squash through the expand the metal lathe, and provided the textile behind it, something like Tyvek or modern roofing felt or non-woven textile of any sort really, is nice and taut, then it will stop the lime render squishing through too much, and then you'll be able to lime render on top. So there's dozens of different ways you could do it just with anything when you're building. You know, give it a go. But I'll come back later when I've started sponging things up and show you some of the problems that you might encounter. So this is the day after, and as you can see, this has all been sponged up now, sticking to the stuff which is on the stud partitioning on this side, and this has mainly been done with just a normal sponge or a decorator sponge. If you look along the wall, you can see there's slight dents here and there, because you'd only really get rid of those by sponge floating it with a big sponge float we saw yesterday, and which would reveal the low points, and then you could fill those in and then float over again. The problem with when you're doing a very thin layer of lime render on a piece of plywood, if you remember from yesterday, which was behind here, is that if you rub it too much, it will just fall off. It doesn't like being bashed about too much. So that's why I just use a small decorator sponge, about the size of twice the size of a slice of bread, and just gently rub over it The key is just to wait until it's gone off. Now down this end this morning, which was the last bit I did yesterday, this was, and you can kind of see, very good light. So this bit here was the last bit I did yesterday, and so I had to sponge this up whilst it was still quite wet. Now you can see this is a lot bumpier than the other bit we just looked at because I sponged it too early, really, before it was ready. So that's why it's good to let the render cure a fair amount, so it's hard to the touch almost before you start sponging it. So for yesterday, I finished this bit here about, probably after lunch, about 2 o'clock, and I sponged it before I went to bed at about 10. So you need in excess of 8 hours really for it to cure properly to the point where you can sponge it. You can see I'm not overly happy with this. It's got various knobbly bits and there's some quite obvious trowel marks down here, but they're the areas where, you know, if you sponge it too much, it'll just slump right off the off the plywood. And so there you go. I hope that's found useful. You can see just here there's some sort of dappling which is showing through from all the holes which are in the plywood. Again, that's because it was sponged too early. And just as an additional note, when you're doing it on block work, like this bit over here, that might be ready to sponge in a couple of hours. So that's one of the main drawbacks of lime rendering on a stud partition, is that it takes so long to cure. Why that is, I don't know. The plywood, I suppose, isn't overly absorbent, unlike the concrete blocks, which are super absorbent and dry, and so that's ready to sponge very soon after putting it on. The plywood, on the other hand, it's quite a smooth surface in many places. Because I didn't put the plywood up straight away, I put some polythene up to stop the insulation flaking off, so it's got the moisture on the back has got nowhere to go. So perhaps that's why it took so long. I have thought after doing it, really I probably would have used OSB instead, because it's more rigid, it's a thicker material, it's the same price, and that would have been probably preferential, to be honest, just because it's not as bendy. But perhaps look for some, I don't know what you could use really. I mean, I suppose it's worth noting that in here I've got a suspended timber floor, so I couldn't put a blockwork wall internally, which I may well have done if I had a ground bearing slab, which is quite common in the UK. So maybe if you want lime render, it's probably better to have blockwork partitioning, to be honest. And if I'd thought about the layout beforehand, no, I actually literally couldn't do that in here, because and where I'm standing here, there's about 1.5 meters before you get to ground level, and I think from memory you can't. Yeah, you can't. I couldn't have filled that and compacted it effectively in order to do a ground bearing slab. Block and beam, could I have done that? I suppose if I'd done block and beam, maybe I could have had internal block walls, I don't know. But so really, I suppose in summary, I think we've already done a summary, but the second summary is that although you can plaster on stud partition, lime render on stud partitioning, it's far from ideal, and it'd be better if you had blockwork partitions. And if you think that's more work, it's probably really not. If you've got the right situation to do it, then it may be a bit slower, but it's probably, for a self-builder as myself, probably not too much in it really. So there you go. Sorry about the waffle at the end, but hopefully some of that was useful, and thanks for watching.